Nobody told Danny Reeves he would have to pee in front of an alien. Yet here he was, standing in a sterile white room on Station Riven, holding a small transparent container while a six-limbed creature named Balyu stared at him with four unblinking eyes and waited. Danny looked at the container. He looked at Balyu. He looked at the container again. "Is there a bathroom, maybe?" Danny asked. Balyu tilted his small head. "I do not understand. This is the sample collection phase. Please proceed." Danny sighed. This was already going worse than he had imagined. And he had imagined it going pretty badly. 3 weeks ago, Danny had been eating leftover curry in his flat in Brisbane when two people in dark suits knocked on his door and told him he had been selected to represent the entire human species in something called the Galactic Evaluation Program. He had laughed. Then he had seen the alien ship hovering silently above his apartment building, and he had stopped laughing. They explained it on the way up. The Concord of Allied Species was a galactic government that had been running for thousands of years. Whenever they made contact with a new civilization, they tested a single representative to measure the species and assign them a tier. Tier 1 was the highest. Tier 6 was the lowest. Most species landed somewhere in the middle. The tier determined what rights, trade access, and travel permissions the species would receive. Danny had asked why they picked him specifically. He was not the strongest human. He was not the smartest. He was a 34-year-old paramedic and former firefighter who once forgot his own PIN number 3 days in a row. The answer was simple. The Concord did not want the best. They wanted the average. A median specimen, they called it. Someone who represented what a typical human could do. Danny fit the profile perfectly, which he tried not to take as an insult. Now he stood on Station Riven, the largest evaluation facility in the sector, surrounded by technology that made everything on Earth look like children's toys. The halls were smooth and curved, the lighting came from nowhere and everywhere, and the air tasted faintly of something sweet that Danny could not name. Overseer Lunarith met him in the processing room after the sample incident. She was tall, taller than any human Danny had ever met, with skin that looked like frosted glass and eyes that shifted color when she blinked. She moved with the careful precision of someone who had done the same job 10,000 times and expected nothing surprising. "You are the human," she said. It was not a question. "Danny," he said and offered his hand. She looked at it like he had offered her a dead fish. He put his hand down. Lunarith walked him through the program. There were 5 tests: endurance, strength, cognitive flexibility, stress response, pain threshold. She said the words like she was reading a grocery list. Each test would start at Tier 6 difficulty and increase until the subject could not continue. Simple, clean, routine. "What happens if I fail?" Danny asked. Lunarith blinked, her eyes shifting from pale blue to amber. "No species has ever failed entirely. The tests simply determine where you belong." Danny nodded slowly. "Right. And where do most species end up?" "Tier 4 or 5, she said. "Occasionally Tier 3 in one category if the species has a notable adaptation." She paused. "I would not set your expectations high. Your species has no recorded genetic engineering, no cybernetic augmentation, and no environmental hardening beyond what your planet provided naturally. So you're saying I'm going to do badly. I am saying the process will be brief." Danny rubbed the back of his neck. He wanted to argue, but honestly, she was probably right. He was nobody special. He could run a decent distance, lift a reasonable amount, and solve a crossword on a good day. He was not going to impress a galactic civilization. Balyu fitted him with biometric sensors while Lunarith reviewed her datapad. The sensors were small adhesive patches that stuck to his chest, temples, wrists, and the base of his spine. They would monitor everything: heart rate, brain activity, hormone levels, muscle output, and about 40 other things Danny did not understand. Balyu paused while attaching the chest sensor. He made a small clicking sound. "Is there a problem?" Lunarith asked without looking up. "His baseline readings," Balyu said quietly. "They are noisy. Noisy. His heart rate fluctuates constantly. His hormone levels shift even at rest. His neural activity is not stable. It is as if his body is always preparing for something." Lunarith glanced at Danny, then back at her pad. "Primitive biology. Unregulated systems. Note it in the file and proceed. Balyu clicked again but said nothing more. Danny stood there with sensors stuck all over him, wearing borrowed clothes that did not quite fit, standing in a room built by species that had mastered interstellar travel, while his own people were still arguing about which way to hang toilet paper. He felt small. He felt ordinary. He felt completely out of his depth. But somewhere underneath all of that, in a part of his brain that had carried burned children out of houses and kept walking when his legs told him to stop, something else stirred. It was not confidence. It was not bravery. It was something quieter and older than both. It was stubbornness. Linowith led him to the first testing chamber. The doors opened onto a vast, featureless floor that hummed beneath his boots. The lights dimmed. The air shifted. Somewhere in the walls, machines began to wake. "Whenever you are ready," Linowith said from the observation room above. Danny took a breath, stepped forward, and said, "Let us get this over with." He had no idea what was coming. Neither did they. The floor beneath Danny's feet started warm and got warmer. Like a tea first, it felt like standing on sun-baked concrete back home, the kind that burns through thin sandals in January. Danny shifted his weight from foot to foot and kept walking on the inclined treadmill that had risen silently from the floor. The incline was gentle. The pace was slow. He could have done this in his sleep. Tier 6 endurance protocol is active. Balyu's voice came through a speaker embedded somewhere in the ceiling. Current temperature, 35 degrees. Please continue walking. Danny continued walking. He had done harder things getting groceries and summer up in the observation room. Linowith watched the biometric feed with minimal interest. She had processed 400 species through this exact test. Most reached their ceiling within the first 3 tiers. The Granahi topped out at Tier 5. The Pelori barely survived Tier 6. She expected the human to slow by Tier 4 and stop by Tier 3, that she increased the difficulty. The temperature climbed to 40 degrees, then 45. The treadmill tilted steeper. Danny's breathing changed, deeper, more rhythmic, but his legs did not slow. Sweat appeared on his forehead, then his arms, then everywhere. It ran down his face and dripped onto the treadmill surface. Balyu leaned closer to his monitor. "Overseer, what is it?" His body is producing fluid at an increasing rate. It appears to be a thermal regulation mechanism. Linowith frowned. "Specify." He is leaking water through his skin. The water evaporates and pulls heat away from his body. He is cooling himself in real time. Balyu's 6 limbs tapped nervously across his console. "I have seen passive heat resistance. I have seen heat avoidance behavior. I have never seen a species actively fight the temperature while continuing to move." Down on the floor, Danny wiped his face with his sleeve and kept going. Through the intercom, he said, "This reminds me of working outdoors in Queensland." 45 degrees was a slow Tuesday. Linowith did not respond. She increased to Tier 3. The room hit 50 degrees. The air shimmered. The treadmill incline was now steep enough that Danny had to lean forward and pump his arms. His heart rate climbed. His skin was flushed red. Every sensor on his body screamed warnings that Balyu had never seen at this stage of test. But Danny kept walking. His pace slowed. His jaw tightened. His hands gripped the side rails. But his feet kept moving, one after the other, steady and stubborn. His core temperature is rising, Balyu reported, but significantly slower than projected. His cooling system is compensating. At this rate, he could sustain Tier 3 for another 20 minutes. Linowith stared at the data. 20 minutes at Tier 3 would put this human alongside the Yoloni, a species that evolved on a volcanic moon. That cannot be right. She pushed to Tier 2. 55 degrees. The air inside the chamber was now hot enough to cause tissue damage in most evaluated species within 90 seconds. The treadmill was nearly vertical. Danny was climbing more than walking. His breathing was ragged. His sweat had soaked through every piece of clothing on his body, but he did not stop. In his mind, Danny was not on a space station. He was back in the hills outside Toowoomba during the fires of 2019. He remembered the heat pressing against his face like a wall. He remembered the weight of his gear and the sound of trees exploding. He remembered walking into it, because someone on the radio said there was a family trapped in a house up the road. This was easier than that. Nothing was on fire. Nobody needed saving. All he had to do was keep putting one foot in front of the other, and he had been doing that his whole life. Baoyu broke protocol. Overseer, I recommend we end the test. His body is approaching failure thresholds. Lunith hesitated. She wanted to see where the limit was. Every species had one, a clear, clean line where biology said no more. She was waiting for that line. It was not coming. Danny's left leg buckled slightly. He caught himself on the rail, grunted, and straightened. His vision was narrowing. His fingers tingled. Somewhere deep in his chest, his heart was beating so hard he could hear it in his ears. In the test, Lunith said quietly. The treadmill slowed. The temperature began to drop. Danny stood still for a moment, swaying, then sat down heavily on the floor. He put his head between his knees and breathed. Baoyu brought him water through a small service hatch. Danny drank the entire container in one long pull, then looked up at the observation window with red-rimmed eyes. Is there any food? He asked. I skipped breakfast. Lunith did not answer. She was staring at the final readout on her screen. Endurance score. Tier 2, that placed the human in the same category as species that had evolved over millions of years specifically for extreme heat survival. Species with reflective skin, internal water storage, and heat-resistant organ structures. Danny had matched them with nothing but sweat, stubbornness, and a body that simply refused to quit. Lunith closed the file and opened a recalibration request. The equipment must have malfunctioned. There was no other explanation. A soft-skinned, water-based biped from an unremarkable yellow star system could not possibly endure at Tier 2. She would run diagnostics overnight and continue the remaining tests in the morning. Down on the testing floor, Danny finished his second container of water, lay flat on his back on the cooling floor, and stared at the ceiling. Queensland was worse, he muttered to nobody, and closed his eyes in the observation room. Baoyu quietly saved a copy of the biometric data to his personal file. He did not know why exactly. He just had a feeling he would want it later. Lunith ran the diagnostics 3 times. The equipment was functioning perfectly. She stood in the observation room the next morning, reviewing the results on her screen, while Danny sat on the testing floor below, eating something he had described as a protein bar that he had brought from Earth. It smelled terrible. Baoyu had moved his workstation 2 meters further from the human because of it. We will proceed with the strength assessment, Lunith said through the intercom. The protocol uses gravitational resistance fields. Objects will increase in mass. You push, pull, lift, and carry until you cannot. Danny stuffed the last of his bar into his mouth and stood up. Sounds like moving day, he said with his mouth full. The first object was simple. A block the size of a suitcase, weighted to Tier 6 standards. Danny picked it up, carried it across the room, and set it down. He did the same with a larger one, and a larger one after that. At Tier 4, he was straining. His face reddened. The veins on his forearms stood out. But he kept going. Lunith noted his score with clinical detachment. Tier 4 in raw strength was unremarkable. Several species scored higher. She was about to end the phase when the system moved to the second stage. Unstable load management. A new object appeared on the floor, roughly the size and shape of a large barrel, but its internal weight shifted constantly. It rolled and tilted and lurched as if something alive was inside it. The test measured not just strength, but the ability to control an unpredictable mass. Danny grabbed it. It immediately tried to tip sideways. He adjusted. It lurched forward. He shifted his stance. It rolled back. He bent his knees and locked it against his chest. Baoyu's monitors lit up. What is happening? Lunith asked. His musculoskeletal system, Baoyu said, his voice higher than usual. It is making corrections. Hundreds of them. Per second. He pointed at the readout. Every time the load shifts, his spine, hips, knees, ankles, and shoulders all adjust independently and simultaneously. His brain is processing gravitational feedback in real time and redistributing force across his entire body. Danny carried the barrel across the room. It fought him the entire way. He fought back, grunting and swearing under his breath in words Balyu's translator could not process. He set it down at the finish point, breathing hard, and shook out his arms. That thing has an attitude, Danny said. His unstable load score. Tier 2. Lunamith stared at the number. Then she moved to the cognitive flexibility test without comment. They brought Danny to a different chamber, this one filled with floating screens and interactive panels. The test was a series of puzzles that changed their rules every 90 seconds. The first round was pure logic. Danny struggled. He got about half the answers right, muttering to himself and scratching his head. Tier 5 at best. The second round switched to spatial reasoning, rotating shapes and fitting them into patterns. Danny improved immediately, his hands moving faster than his mouth, solving through feel rather than thought. Tier 3. The third round introduced mathematics. Danny dropped back to Tier 5. He laughed about it. Numbers and me are not friends, he told the ceiling. Then the fourth round changed everything. The puzzle became social. Simulated alien figures appeared on screen, each displaying subtle body language cues, posture shifts, eye movements, color changes. Danny had to determine which figures were trustworthy and which were deceptive, then choose a path based on his reading. He failed the first attempt completely. The second attempt, he got one right. On the third attempt, something shifted. Danny stopped thinking. He stopped analyzing. He looked at the figures the way he looked at patients in the field, quickly, instinctively, reading distress signals that no textbook had ever taught him. His accuracy hit 70%. Balua checked the number twice. 70% on social deception reading was higher than species with dedicated neural organs for detecting lies. Danny was doing it with nothing but gut instinct and years of reading frightened faces in emergency rooms. Cognitive flexibility score, Tier 3 composite, with a Tier 2 spike in adaptive social reading. Lunarith set down her datapad. She walked to the far side of the observation room and stood facing the wall for a long moment. Balyu watched her, but said nothing. When she turned around, her eyes had shifted to a deep, unsettled violet, a color Balyu had never seen her display. Pull up the historical composite records, she said. Balyu did. 400 species, neatly categorized, each with a clear profile. Strong but slow, smart but fragile, fast but emotionally brittle. Every species excelled in one or two areas and dropped sharply in others. That was normal. That was how biology worked. You invested energy in what kept you alive and accepted weakness everywhere else. He placed Danny's data alongside them. The human had no spike. He had no crash. His profile was a flat, elevated line across every category they had tested so far, sitting at Tier 2 or 3 in everything. No species in the history of the program had ever done that. He is not a specialist, Balyu said quietly. No, Lunarith agreed. He is not a generalist either. Generalists score Tier 4 or 5 across the board. He is scoring 2 full tiers above generalist average. Lunarith said nothing. Balyu looked at his overseer carefully. What is he then? Lunarith pulled up the final 2 test protocols, stress response and pain threshold, and scheduled them for the following morning. Her hands were steady. Her voice was calm, but her eyes stayed violet. That, she said, is what I intend to find out. Danny did not sleep well that night. The quarters they gave him were comfortable enough, a small room with a bed that adjusted to his body shape and a window that showed a view of distant stars. But every time he closed his eyes, he thought about the test still waiting for him. The strength and endurance had been hard. The puzzles had made his head hurt. But the next one, the stress response, had been described to him by Balyu in a quiet voice as a simulated survival environment with escalating threat conditions. Danny had been in enough real survival environments to know that simulated ones could still break you. He gave up on sleep around what he guessed was 4 in the morning, station time, and spent an hour doing push-ups and stretches on the floor. By the time Balyu came to collect him, Danny had already eaten the last of his Earth food and was sitting cross-legged on the bed, staring out the window. Are you ready? Balyu asked from the doorway. No, Danny said honestly. Let us go. The stress chamber looked different from the others. It was darker. The walls were not smooth but textured, like rough stone. The air was cooler, and carried a faint smell of something damp and wrong. Danny felt his pulse rise before anything had even started. Lunith's voice came from above. The stress response test places you in a simulated environment designed to trigger survival instincts. The simulation is not real, but will engage all your senses fully. You will feel, hear, smell, and see everything as if it were happening. The difficulty will increase in stages. You may exit at any time by saying the word stop. Danny nodded. Got it. The lights went out. Then the world changed. He was inside a building. Concrete walls. Low ceiling. Emergency lighting flickering red. The floor shook beneath him and dust fell from cracks above. Somewhere behind him, a wall collapsed with a sound that rattled his teeth. Water was rising from below, cold and black, already at his ankles. Tier 6. Standard collapse scenario. Danny moved. He checked the ceiling for weak points, found the exit path, and waded through the water toward it. His heart was beating fast, but his hands were steady. He had been inside buildings like this in real life. The training kicked in without him asking for it. He reached the exit in under 2 minutes. The simulation reset. Tier 5. The building was bigger. The collapse was faster. Fire joined the water. Danny moved quicker, using his arms to shield his face from heat, finding paths through the wreckage with an efficiency that made Balua lean forward in his chair. Tier 4. The oxygen began to thin. The water rose to his waist. The structure groaned and shifted around him like a living thing trying to swallow him. And then the screaming started. Somewhere at his left, buried under rubble, voices cried out. They were not human voices. They were alien, high and sharp and desperate. But the terror in them was universal. Danny froze for exactly 1 second. Then he turned away from the exit and moved toward the screaming. Balua flagged the deviation immediately. The subject is moving in the wrong direction. He is moving toward the threat source instead of the extraction point. Lunith watched the screen without blinking. I see that. Should I correct his path? No. Let him go. Danny found them. 2 simulated figures trapped under a fallen beam. They were not real. Some part of his brain knew that, but it did not matter. The sounds they made were real enough. The fear on their faces was real enough. And Danny Reeves had never in his life walked away from someone asking for help. He braced his legs, grabbed the beam, and lifted. It weighed more than anything in a strength test. His back screamed. His knees shook, but the beam rose centimeter by centimeter, and the 2 figures scrambled free. Danny dragged them both toward the exit, one under each arm, while the ceiling rained concrete and the water reached his chest. He made it out with seconds to spare, gasping, soaked, shaking. Tier 3. Then Tier 2. The simulation grew worse. More victims. Less time. Harder choices. At Tier 2, the scenario presented him with a calculation that no species in the program's history had ever been tested on because no species had ever gone deep enough to reach it. The exit was closing. The structure was seconds from total collapse. 2 simulated figures were still trapped. If Danny went back for them, he would not make it out. His biometrics went haywire. Stress hormones flooded his bloodstream at levels that should have shut down his motor function. His heart rate hit a number that made Balua reach for the emergency override. Danny stood at the exit, looked back at the 2 figures, and went back. He pulled them free. He pushed them toward the exit. The ceiling came down. Danny died in the simulation. The chamber lights returned. Danny was on his knees on the floor, hands flat on the ground, breathing so hard that his whole body shook. Sweat and simulated water dripped from his face. His eyes were wide and unfocused. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Danny looked up at the observation window and asked, in a voice that cracked halfway through, "Did they make it? The 2 at the end. Did they get out?" Balua looked at Lunith. Lunith looked at Danny. "They were not real," she said carefully. Danny nodded. He knew that. He wiped his face with his sleeve and sat back on his heels. His hands were still trembling. He laughed a small, broken, exhausted sound. "Yeah," he said. "I know. But did they make it?" Lunith checked the simulation log. The 2 figures had reached the exit before the collapse. "Yes," she said. "They survived." Danny closed his eyes and let out a long breath. Good. Balyu had tried to enter the stress response score into the system. The system rejected it. There was no tier for what Danny had demonstrated. The test measured survival instinct. It measured how far a species would go to save itself. Danny had not tried to save himself at all. He had tried to save everyone else. And when saving everyone else meant dying, he had accepted that without hesitation. Balyu created a manual entry. In the notes field, he typed 4 words he had never used in any evaluation before. Behavior exceeds measurement parameters. Lunith read the note over his shoulder and said nothing. Her eyes had gone violet again, deeper this time, almost black. She had one test left. She was no longer sure she wanted to run it. Balyu found Danny in the medical bay the next morning, sitting on the edge of a bed with his feet hanging off the side like a kid at the doctor's office. He had a bruise on his left shoulder from the stress test simulation and a distant look in his eyes that Balyu had learned to recognize. Humans called it thinking, but it looked an awful lot like damage. The final test is today, Balyu said from the doorway. He kept his voice soft. Danny had been kind to him throughout the process, and Balyu found that kindness difficult to forget. Pain threshold assessment. You could decline if you wish. Danny looked at him. Can I really? Yes. The Concord Charter grants every subject the right to withdraw from any individual test. Your existing scores would be submitted as a partial evaluation. Danny was quiet for a moment. Then he rubbed his face with both hands and slid off the bed. Let's finish it. The pain chamber was the smallest room Danny had been in so far. A single chair sat in the center, padded and reclined, with sensors built into the armrests and headrest. It looked like a dentist chair designed by someone who hated dentists. 2 thin metal bands would wrap around his wrists, and a neural interface collar would sit at the base of his skull. The system would send graduated pain signals directly into his nervous system, clean, controlled, and measurable. Lunith briefed him from the observation room. Her voice was flat and professional, but Balyu noticed she was gripping her data pad harder than usual. The stimulation begins at Tier 6 and increases. It is not tissue damage. Your body will not be harmed, but your nervous system will experience the signals as genuine pain. You may say stop at any time. Danny sat in the chair. The bands closed around his wrists. The collar settled against his neck. He gripped the armrests and looked up at the observation window. Ready, he said. Tier 6 was a dull ache, like a headache that had been going on for hours. Danny barely reacted. He shifted in the chair and breathed slowly. Tier 5 was sharper. A hot, stabbing sensation that ran from his wrists up through his arms and into his shoulders. Danny winced. His grip on the armrest tightened. But he said nothing that ate Tier 4. His jaw clenched. His breathing became controlled and deliberate, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the same rhythm every first responder on Earth was taught during training. His eyes were closed. His body was rigid. Balyu watched the monitors. Danny's brain was responding to the pain signals in a way that confused the system. Standard pain response in most species followed a clean curve. Stimulus increased, distress increased, function decreased. Danny's distress was increasing, but his brain was simultaneously releasing chemicals that fought the signal. Endorphins, adrenaline, something else the system could not identify, but that appeared to be linked to emotional memory. Overseer Balyu said, his neurochemistry is anomalous. Explain. His brain is not just enduring the pain. It is actively suppressing it using multiple chemical pathways at once. Some are standard pain inhibitors, but one pathway appears to be tied to his emotional centers. It is as if his brain is using memories to generate resistance. Lunith leaned forward. Which memories? I cannot tell from the data, only that his emotional cortex is firing at the same rate as his pain receptors. They are fighting each other. In the chair, Danny was somewhere else. The pain was real. It was very, very real. It filled his arms and his chest and pressed against the inside of his skull like a hand squeezing his brain. But behind the pain, underneath it, there was something older that he was 26 again, standing in the doorway of a burning house in suburban Brisbane. His captain was screaming at him over the radio to pull back. The roof was compromised. The structure was minutes from collapse. But inside, through the smoke, he could hear a child crying he had gone in. The heat melted his gloves to his hands. He felt every millimeter of it. But the child was 4 years old and screaming and alone. And Danny picked her up and held her against his chest and walked out through the fire because there was nothing else in the world he could have done. The pain in his hands lasted for weeks. The skin healed slowly. But he never once regretted it because the girl's mother had been waiting outside. And the sound she made when Danny put the child in her arms was worth every scar. That was the memory his brain found now. Not the pain of it. The purpose of it. The knowledge that pain was not the end. It was what you walked through on the way to the thing that mattered. Tier 3 hit. Danny made a sound, low and tight, through clenched teeth. His knuckles were white on the armrests. His heart rate was dangerous. Tier 2 that his left hand went numb. His vision narrowed to a tunnel. His body was beginning to shut down in pieces, pulling resources from his extremities and pouring them into his core, keeping the important things alive as long as possible. It was a survival mechanism built into every human body since the earliest days of the species, the ability to sacrifice the edges to save the center. Danny did not say stop. Balu's hands moved across his console. Overseer, his peripheral nervous system is failing. If we proceed to Tier 1, there is a risk of lasting neural feedback damage. The simulation is safe, but his body does not know that. His nervous system is responding as if the threat is real. Lunith hesitated. In the test, she said, Balu hit the override. The pain stopped. The bands released. The collar lifted. Danny slumped in the chair. His chest heaved. His skin was gray-white, drained of color. His hands trembled in his lap. Fingers curling and uncurling as sensation slowly returned. He looked up at the observation window with glassy eyes. Thank you, he said to Balu, not to Lunith. To Balu, because Balu was the one who had stopped it, and Danny could feel that it had been a choice made out of concern, not protocol. That Balu's 4 eyes blinked rapidly. He did not know what to say. Lunith stood in the observation room alone for a long time after Danny was taken back to the medical bay. She replayed the data. She studied the curve. She looked for the clean, sharp line where biology reached its absolute limit and function ceased. It was not there. Danny's pain threshold did not have a wall. It had a slope. His body kept finding new ways to push, new chemicals to release, new memories to burn as fuel. He felt everything. The system confirmed that. He was not numb. He was not chemically resistant. He felt every single degree of pain the machine could produce. He just did not stop. Lunith opened a new classification file. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a long time. Then she typed the words she had never typed in 20 years of evaluations. Untired. Requires counsel review. She saved the file, closed her screen, and sat in the dark observation room with her violet-black eyes reflecting the distant stars outside the window. She had tested over 400 species. She had cataloged the strongest, the fastest, the most brilliant minds in the galaxy. She had never once been frightened by a test result. She was frightened now. 7 chairs stood in a half circle in the council chamber of Station Riven. 7 species. 7 representatives who governed the concord of allied species and had done so, in one form or another, for 10,000 years. Between them, they had made decisions that shaped the fate of entire civilizations. Today, they were looking at a chart about a paramedic from Brisbane, and none of them could speak. Lunith stood at the center of the chamber, her data projected onto a floating screen behind her. She had spent the last hour walking the council through each test result one at a time, methodical and precise. Endurance, strength, cognitive flexibility, stress response, pain threshold. She presented the numbers without commentary and let the data do the talking. T talked loudly. Counselor Dreth of the Brith spoke first. He was a heavy, armored figure with a voice like grinding stone. Tier 2 in endurance is notable but not unprecedented. The Yoloni achieved Tier 1 decades ago. Correct, Lunith said. No single result is unprecedented. That is not the issue. She changed the display. Danny's composite profile appeared beside the 400 other species in the database. Every other species showed the same basic shape, a spike in one or two categories and a sharp drop in the rest. The Brith spiked in strength and dropped in cognitive flexibility. The Yeloni spiked in endurance and dropped in stress response. The Pelori spiked in cognition and dropped in everything physical. Danny's line was flat. Not flat at the bottom, flat near the top. Tier 2 or Tier 3 across every single category, stretching from one end of the chart to the other like a horizon line drawn through the upper atmosphere of the entire database. The chamber went silent. Counselor Yin of the Celesture, a slender being with silver-scaled skin, leaned forward. This must be an error. No species performs uniformly at this level. Biology requires trade-offs. You invest in one system at the cost of another. That is what I believed as well, Luneth said. I recalibrated the equipment 3 times. The results held. Then the subject is an outlier, a genetic anomaly among his kind. He was selected specifically because he is not. The Concord's own profiling system identified him as a median representative. Average intelligence, average physical capability, average emotional resilience. She paused. By human standards, the weight of that last sentence settled over the room like dust. Elder Marith of the Yeloni was the oldest council member, her body weathered and slow, but her mind as sharp as it had been a century ago. She spoke rarely, and when she did, the others listened. How? She said, is this possible for a species with no genetic engineering, no cybernetic augmentation, and no deliberate environmental hardening? Luneth pulled up a file on Earth. Class, 12 planet. Shifting climate zone. Active tectonic plates. Predators in every biome. Diseases that mutated faster than most species could develop immunity. A rotational cycle that forced the inhabitants into periodic unconsciousness for a third of their lives, leaving them vulnerable to everything. Humans did not evolve to master one environment, Lunarith said. They evolved to survive all of them. Their bodies are a collection of compromises, each one individually unremarkable, but together forming a system that can adapt to nearly any condition. They cool themselves with sweat. They heal from wounds that would kill most species. They can function on minimal sleep, reduced oxygen, extreme heat, extreme cold, and high levels of pain simultaneously. She paused again. But that is not what concerns me. She switched to the stress response data. The room watched the replay of Danny turning away from the exit and going back for the simulated figures. They watched him carry 2 strangers through a collapsing building. They watched him die. He was not ordered to do that, Luneth said. There was no command structure, no directive, no veluscenori incentive. He was alone in a failing environment with a clear exit, and he chose to go back for individuals he had never met and who were not even real. Counselor Dreth shifted in his seat. Self-sacrifice exists in other species. The Granai hive workers will die to protect their queen. That is genetically programmed hierarchical obedience, Lunarith said. This was a choice. His biometrics confirm he was fully aware of the consequences. His fear response was at maximum. He knew he would die. He went back anyway. What? Counselor Yin asked. Lunarith looked at the council. I asked him, he said, and I quote, because they were scared and I was closer. Nobody spoke for a long time. Elder Marith broke the silence. Her voice was low and careful. In 10,000 years of galactic civilization, we have built walls to keep out the strong. We have built cages to contain the clever. We have built treaties to manage the ambitious. But we have never once prepared for a species that would walk through fire, not to conquer, but to carry someone else out. The debate lasted 4 more hours. Some council members wanted restrictions. Some wanted recruitment. Some wanted to classify humans as a potential threat and monitor them. But in the end, the vote was unanimous. Humans were granted Tier 1 classification across all categories. The first species in the history of the Concord to achieve it. A new subsection was added to the Concord Charter, not as a restriction, but as a recognition of something the system had never been designed to measure. 1 week later, Danny stood at the observation deck of Station Riven, looking out at the galaxy. His shoulder still ached from the stress test. His hands still tingled from the pain assessment. He looked tired and ordinary and entirely unimpressive. Luneth found him there. Your species has been granted full Tier 1 status, she said. Danny frowned. What does that mean exactly? It means the galaxy considers humanity the most dangerous species ever evaluated. Danny laughed. It was the same laugh he had on the first day, easy and confused and a little embarrassed. That is ridiculous. I am just a paramedic from Brisbane. Luneth looked at him. Her eyes were still violet, but softer now, closer to something Balyu might have called wonder. Yes, she said. That is precisely what concerns them. Danny looked back out at the stars. Somewhere out there, billions of beings on thousands of worlds were being told about his species for the first time. He thought about that. Then he thought about home. Then he thought about the burned girl he had carried out of that house all those years ago, and how she would be 12 now, probably in school, probably not thinking about him at all. He smiled. So what happens next? He asked. Luneth stood beside him and looked out at the same stars. Everything, she said. Behind them, Balyu sat at a console and watched them both. He had saved every piece of data from the entire evaluation to his personal files. Not because the Concord required it. Not because Luneth had asked. Because he had met a human. And he had a feeling that was the kind of thing you would want to remember.